This is 10, 2016. When is the first time in your life that you were aware that there were little tiny things that made up stuff called atoms? Did you know that before you started school? Did you learn that in first grade? Did you get that in a fourth grade science class someplace? Did you not hear about atoms until you were in middle school? Where does that pop up? A lot of that depends on who your parents are and what your elementary teachers were like. Some elementary teachers just plain old flat out don't do science. Some parents plain old flat out don't do science. My daughter right now could tell you that atoms are little tiny things that make up the world. But she has a science teacher for a mother. So when's the first time you knew that there were these little tiny pieces that made up the world? I'll pause. Okay, so a lot of us kind of take it for granted, and only one of you was brave enough to answer the question, but a lot of us take it for granted that the world is made up of these little tiny things, and we know that. Like I said, my daughter, who's not yet 4, knows that. And you guys probably knew about it somewhere in elementary, and you really started to dig into it in middle school. Well, people have been wondering what the world was made up of for a very long time. And Democritus was a Greek philosopher. He lived from 460 to 370 BCE, that's before Common Era. And remember that in the period before Common Era, dates appear backwards to us because we're counting down to 0 and then moving back up, so it's like a number line. When I say Democritus was a philosopher, that's important. Because in this period of history, there isn't science as we know it. There is no science. There is natural philosophy, which is thinking about the natural world. So that distinction about Democritus being a natural philosopher, somebody who is thinking philosophically about the world, is really important because the thing to remember, and a lot of you said, Democritus had a theory. Be careful. We're in science here, so we use the word theory differently. A theory in science is started off as a hypothesis. Theory in a scientific sense started off as a hypothesis, and it is a hypothesis, a working explanation that has repeatedly been supported, where we've seen no evidence that says, nope, that's not actually how it works. So a theory in a scientific sense is very solid. A theory is not something to be taken lightly. What Democritus had was not a scientific theory. What Democritus had was a philosophical idea. And that's a really important distinction. And people say, have said things like, Democritus didn't prove a darn thing. Democritus didn't prove anything. Democritus had philosophical ideas about how the world was made up that he discussed. And yes, some of you correctly pointed out that he actually stole most of those ideas from his teacher, Lepicus, I think. I'm bad with Greek. Lepicus, Lebitica, something. Anyway, his teacher. But he was the better voice for those ideas. So we think of Democritus as having been the first person to propose this sort of what becomes called an atomic worldview. And Democritus's philosophical idea was that you could take any lump of matter and you could cut it in half, and you would have two halves that had the same properties as the original chunk. And then you could take one of those and cut it in half again, and you would now have two lumps that had the same properties as the original lump. And you could keep doing this, cutting them in half, and in half again, and in half again, and in half again. And I think he imagined it with a stone. Until you got down to some little tiny piece that you couldn't divide anymore. That there was some undividable, indivisible unit of stuff. And he didn't have the word matter. He probably would have said substance. But, that there was some unit of stuff that you could get down to by repeatedly dividing something in half and half and half until you got to a point where it was no longer cuttable. And atomos was from the Greek for indivisible. The fact that we end up calling the little tiny pieces that make up our world atoms is actually just sort of a tip of the hat to Democritus as the first person to voice this atomic worldview. So he didn't invent atoms, he didn't invent atomos, Some people incorrectly identify the word atom with Democritus. The word atom doesn't come for a long time after this. You know, he is proposing a philosophical idea. No proof to back it up, no experimentation, no kind of scientific method or scientific thinking. This is all philosophy. This is a couple of Greeks, nice jug of wine, some olive oil, and a whole lot of shooting the breeze. Okay, it's a little more than that. But it's talk. There's no hard data to back this up. And when you have no hard data, boy, are there analogies for this year's political process. When you have no actual data, no scientific facts, no hard on the ground facts, anybody can say anything they darn well please. See the analogy? I'm sorry, the scientific worldview. You got to have data, folks. You got to have data. So Aristotle is yet another Greek philosopher, again, a student of natural philosophy and a teacher of natural philosophy. And he comes along a little bit later than Democritus. So Democritus dies in, 370? Aristotle's born in 384. And during his, what we could call his working life, the period of his life where he is writing and publishing and discussing, and he is a public philosopher, he says that the atomists, the people who believe that there is this little particle that is undividable, uncuttable, he thinks their stuff is bunk. Worthless. Nope, it's not the way it works. And he believes that matter is what he calls continuous. That there is no point where you can get to that you cannot continue to divide it and it still has its properties. That there's no fundamental unit. It's a more fluid view of matter. And he actually, his philosophical explanation for what we're all made of, what rocks and tables and desks and wine and olive oil and bread and chickens and cypress trees and the ocean and the air are made of, is that there are 4 elements. There's earth, air, fire, and water. Now, be careful. And I didn't see anybody make this mistake this year, but it's happened in the past. People have said, well, Aristotle is the first person to say that there are elements. This is not the kind of elements that you and I talk about in chemistry. These are not the elements with which you are familiar. These are the elements of nature. And he believes that, based on how much earth and fire is contained in an object or a person or an animal, that gives it its properties. And there's a view of Aristotelian medicine where, a disease can be caused because someone has too much water in their constitution. They need to be dried out. Someone has too much fire in their constitution. Fevers, as we all know, medically, are in excess of the fire element in one's constitution. Some crazy stuff. But here's the thing. Remember, this is all philosophy. This is not science. There's no data to back this up. There's no experimentation. There's no evidence. So you know who wins? Gosh, there are fantastic analogies. You know who wins? The person who's better at stirring emotion. Oh my God. The person who is a better PR getter. The person who is a more convincing speaker. The person who can sway the heart and with it the mind. And Aristotle happens to be really, really good at this. Very convincing guy. And if you go back, you can actually find, there are online sources where you can see Aristotle's writings. And to a modern person who has an understanding of science, they look like the biggest bunch of voodoo you'd ever want to see. They're wacky. They're kind of cool, but they're weird. Interesting to look at. So he was really convincing, which means that he kind of won the PR war for a very long time. A very long time. Out of Aristotle's ideas, mostly. Okay. We'll talk about this and then we'll go. those ideas from Aristotle and Plato are developed in what is sort of this proto-chemistry. It's a forerunner to chemistry, and it's really a forerunner to science. And alchemy is a movement. It's not an individual. It's a discipline. And the people who practice this really starts out in Greece. It is well developed in the Islamic world. The Middle East and North Africa are sort of hotbeds of intellectual development during this period. And then this continues to spread into Asia. There are Chinese alchemists, and there's a huge surge of alchemy in what we typically call the Dark Ages in Europe, sort of the Middle Ages prior to the Renaissance. Dark, and then Renaissance, the dawning of light and intellect and all that good stuff. So alchemists had a lot of funny ideas. They accepted Aristotle's view of matter as this continuous thing with different quantities of fire and water and earth and air. And they thought that they could take substances and change them from one to the other. And one of the big ones was what they called transmuting base metals. And this would be the big one that we all think about is turning lead into gold. So base metals are, base, those base metals, again, dark, primitive, sort of tarnishy and ugly, where the higher metals, gold and silver, the shiny, bright, pretty ones that we all think are cool. And they were really interested in that. But they also thought that by doing this kind of transmutation, they could cure disease, they could solve all the world's problems. So that was all kind of nonsense. But there were some things they did that weren't nonsense. Now, they didn't really contribute anything to our understanding of the atom, but they did contribute to chemistry. So the distillation processes that are still used today were developed in their most basic form by alchemists. There is glassware we still use in chemistry labs today that was developed by alchemists. So it's not that they contributed nothing to chemistry, but they certainly didn't contribute anything to our worldview, our understanding of the atom. Okay, that's where we'll stop for today. We'll come back tomorrow.